Hi there, and welcome to the Consultants Growth Playbook, where every week we interview consultants that are actively in the trenches, building and leading business development for successful consulting practices.
I'm really pleased to have John Howard with me on the call today. So, John, when I get people on the podcast, firstly, welcome.
Thank you.
And then the first question I usually ask is there one specific way that you've used to generate new business or contribute to business development over the years?
I mean, I subscribe with you that BD in consulting, being kind of anything probably, is really about relationships, and it's about really listening and letting the client lead you to what the pain point is, and then being really honest about whether you can help with that pain point. And when you can, great. And when you can't, don't try to. I would say, I think so much of BD is about trust and people really feeling that you're there for them and not for your own interest. So if I had to say any one way, it would be about kind of listen a lot and be genuinely trustworthy in your interactions.
That's fantastic. And you won't be surprised to hear that many people have said that previously.
Good.
So if I was going to push you a little bit on that then, so trust is the thing and listening. How do you get into those conversations? Or how do you get it to the stage where you can be positioned in the right place, in the right room to have that level of trust and to be able to listen and get into that level of conversation?
But I think so much of consulting sales is about networks and either people you know that you're staying in touch with, or people that you might have a suspicion about they have a need, and kind of opening a conversation around that, not being afraid to people referring you in to because you've got a trusting relationship with somebody else who knows somebody who might need something similar, or sometimes it's a cold introduction. But I think it's all about how are you positioning yourself, positioning the business you're in. And I think quite a humble and I'm here to listen and help mode. I think that the moment you're in heavy, people often when you're in a new relationship, people know you're potentially selling to them, right? And they probably wouldn't have you in the room with them if they weren't open to that or open to some kind of relationship. So kind of everybody knows what the game is, right? But I think just when you are in that, being genuinely interested and coming across that way, and not coming across of, I have a definite objective, I want to leave here having sealed the deal. So I don't know if that answers the question, but I think that there's lots of different ways you get the opportunity to be in a room where you might have a sales opportunity. I think it's about how do you behave and interact with the person when that opportunity presents itself and you're in the room, so that it comes across in the right way. Now, that's a very personal view of me about kind of how you approach those interactions.
Hey, John, you can only give your personal view, and I would ask you to be on the podcast if it was any different. So, have you ever had over your career a systemized way of managing and looking after your network and or referrals? Because those were the two main things that you said there.
Yeah, I think I've gotten probably more disciplined about that in more recent years. I think that I've probably always been good at, like, if I know something needs to get done, I have enough mechanisms in my life for making different lists that make sure I keep my promise, which I think is really important. So I'm pretty good at running a to-do list. I'm not always been as good about just maintaining network. And I think that, for me, the tactic that works best around that is almost like that's got to be part of the to-do list as well, which can sound really horrible, but like everybody just gets busy and you lose track of checking in with people. But I think also over the years, I've learned that, like, for the most part, people you've got to know reasonably well don't mind being checked in on.
Yeah.
And I think there can be a bashfulness about, well, particularly if if you worked with somebody in the past and, do I reach out, or are they just going to think I want something? Well, actually, no, there's lots of different ways to keep touch with people. So I think you've got to recognize that like nobody's going to be offended because you ask how they're doing. And if they are, then fine. But then you've got to kind of get a bit systematic about whatever that works for people. Some people just comes naturally, they never forget. For me, it's kind of, different ways of just reminding myself to make sure I reached out.
Fantastic. Yeah. So with my work that I do with clients, absolutely, they're kind of bashful. It's my network. It's like as a consultant, you're an ideas generation machine, and you have to start the process somewhere. But sometimes you can reach out and say, hey, been thinking of you. Got a couple of new ideas, how we work. I've been working on a number of different areas. A couple of new ideas you might be interested in. It just takes some ideas. For whatever reason, people are bashful. So John, at the beginning, didn't introduce you. So you're currently with Garwood Growth, which is a consultancy into consultancies. And before that, you were sort of in the professional services space, I'd say internet famous or LinkedIn famous. You work with Channel 3 Consulting. Yeah. And that really interests me as well, because with Channel 3, and we'll come back to Garwood Growth, so, I'm really trying to hear what you're doing there. But with Channel 3, you led an MBO.
I did.
Is that right?
Yep, I did.
With some phenomenal results. And a lot of that was focused around, my lane in business development. So where you potentially weren't doing the business development, but you were building that business development function. I guess, what were the key steps that you took for Channel 3 to achieve that steady and quite large growth?
I think it's, when I joined Channel 3, it was a business that had been, running really successfully for about 10 years. It was a pretty typical founder-owned, founder-led business where a small number of people who'd been there for a long time were doing the majority of the business development. They were also they'd win something, they'd go and deliver it, and then they'd win some more and had been very successful in that. But it was very founder dependent, and it was very heavily reliant on some key rainmakers, which I think the reality is in any consulting business, that's kind of the way it is to a certain extent. It's about how many, and it's not just being that, right? So, we, and when I joined, the guys and gals who had built the business were wanting to do an exit. So there's an explicit kind of remit for me around, give us a path to going and handing it over to a next generation. And one of the key, and the route we took on that was to go through a private equity backed management buyout. And one of the key elements that any investor was going to be looking at was, well, who's doing that? Who's winning the work, particularly given that the founders and others who had been critical of that wanted to exit as part of the deal. So who's winning the work? How many people are there? How much dependency do we have on people who've done it in the past, and how are we going to grow out from that? So first step was really making sure we had a core group of people who were going to be staying beyond that transaction point, who could sell, who had good networks, who understood that selling was going to be really, really key to our success, and who were up for that. I think the next thing we did was get in pretty quickly to trying to get the sales mindset out of just a few people at a partner level into the whole of the business. So as is often the case in a consulting business, you had people who loved doing client delivery and thought sales was a dirty word and something that they were afraid of or thought was a bit kind of just grubby. And you see that in a lot of consulting firms, big or small. And so we actually engaged a firm who helped us with sales training, and it was very, very small in terms of sales process, right? There's an element of that, and very majoring on sales mindset. So how do you, and the real emphasis there was kind of back to what I talked about at the beginning. It's about having conversations, exploring client challenges in those, really keeping your mouth closed and listening a lot, and until it's time to, as you said, generate ideas and have some opinions, right? But really focused on Sales is about building relationships and understanding and adding value in a conversation and then exploring that with the client. So we found that we ran that with kind of intensively with senior people, our partner in what we call managing consultant level, but then also did a kind of light touch of that with everybody in the whole business. And we did that a few times so that everybody began to realize that sales is about having conversations and exploring opportunities. And sometimes you're the person who can help with that, and sometimes you're not. So there's a kind of like, we got to get over the kind of founder element. There's a, how do we broaden that out? And then we really started looking for people who could join the business, who were interested in growth. And by virtue of that, weren't afraid of the sales challenge that comes in with that. We were trying to enter some new markets. So we brought in some people who could build businesses that Channel 3 had never had before. So we'd never been in the social care space, for example. So we brought in an initial partner who led that, did a great job. Worked really, yeah.
But one of the things you said like a couple of minutes back,
yeah, sure.
was, like, we brought in people with networks, and then we were looking at. So when you were actively recruiting to bring this new business development function in, was there a way of, I guess, assessing or looking at, tangibility of their network and how they could bring value through a network?
I think it's really hard. I mean, and just to be clear, we were never bringing people who were going to be pure BD. Right?
Yeah,
I think it's really hard to get purity because clients want to buy from people that then also they see after the deal's done, right? But it's really hard. I think there's a lot you can do to kind of talk to. If you've been around consulting for a long time, you can kind of ask people in enough different ways to see whether the network they say they bring is actually really the network and what they've achieved through that, right? I think you can do some talking to other people about them. And actually in our space, there was, it was a pretty niche business in terms of what we offered. So you could do some kind of cross-checking relatively easily. And, it wasn't a market of hundreds of candidates you were looking at. It would have been, dozens. And so, but I think it's always a bit of a gamble for both the candidate and the hiring firm as to whether or not they're going to be able to actually land in the business, bring something additive, sell within that, and grow, or whether it won't work. And sometimes it doesn't. And that's like, I think that's the reality of it. I wish I had the magic solution of here's how you make it always get right. Some of that's about like the kind of firm they've come from and the kind of firm they're going into. Some of it's about cultural fit, some of it's about network. But, I think we got it right most of the time. And sometimes it doesn't end up working. So I wish I had the perfect solution, but I'm not sure I do.
Oh, John, come on. Hey, I never expected that. Yeah. And the other thing that I wanted to ask you around here is that, like you say, the founder-led business is very often intrinsically tied up with the expert positioning of the founders, the visible authority or the expert positioning or whatever moniker you put to where they're speaking, what stages they're on, what, conferences they're presenting at. There's a period where that becomes, the floor, and that's building the revenue base. So how do you then transition that away from them, right, to move to that next phase? Was there a plan? Was there something that took that into account?
I don't think we, think because of where they were as the founders of the business and the timing in which they wanted to exit, we probably didn't have as much time to work on that as you might ideally want to, and as we'd advise in the growth business that I'm in now, kind of, I'd probably give that a bit more time than we had to. I think we were fortunate in Channel 3 the founders were doing a lot of selling. There were some people who they brought in recently who were also in that. But it wasn't a big kind of, that's the founder hero who is the brand business, right? You see some places where there's a singular thought leader who is so at the forefront of the brand that when that goes, like, what is the brand without that person? We were not that kind of business. I think that, but I think in any founder scenario, first step is the founder's got to be willing to let go. And I think lots of founders find that really, really hard. Yeah. And they don't necessarily have to all let go completely.
even if they say that's the thing that they want. I want to, like, but
it's like, there's a kind of that's a whole different topic about kind of founder complexity, and we deal with lots of founder-led businesses in Garwood, and it's a great space to be able to operate in. But there's so many things that come into what the business means to the founder and how letting go of some of that. But that I digress. So I think, first step is you've got to be willing to let go of it. Second is you've then got to actively manage that other people start to take the limelight and other people's voices start to be heard. And whether that's being on the speaker circuit or being the person who's the front of something on LinkedIn, or being the person who is taking the lead in an interaction with a client, that person's got to be confident enough and have their confidence built to step into that. And the person who's been doing it, whether that's a founder or whether that's a senior person who's trying to bring others through, I think it's equally relevant, has to be prepared to step back. And I think but genuinely, right? They got to go, if you go into a meeting with two people and it's a founder or a senior person and somebody you're trying to bring through, you've got to just like really major on, I'm not going to dominate the conversation. And I think that takes some pretty active management, because people just forget. They've been so used to being in the role they're in. I think active management of that is key.
And do you think that could even potentially be willing to accept that, potentially revenues or some deals will be lost as a direct consequence of that?
Yeah. And I mean, I think there's ways to manage that. I think that I'm not sure I'd advocate from just, be prepared to lose lots of stuff, because, you're trying. I think there might be times when that happens. Yeah. But I think you've got to see the founder and the person there as a safety net. I think there's a safety net role that can be played, whether it's in the background, completely invisible to what's going on with the client, or kind of in a secondary role in meetings and interactions or stuff that keeps stuff from getting lost. But sometimes stuff does, right? And I think it's like, if you're in that situation where we're prepared to lose some things to develop people, then just pick which ones you're prepared to lose, right? So you're not losing something that's going to break the business. But it's, and I think that, it's linked to that. There's something about, if there are incentive structures or compensation structures in the business that incentivize financially or for kind of visibility, one person being the lead on that, then you've got to break that down in order to, you've got to make success for the person who's trying to step back be about having stepped back. So you don't want somebody kind of on a heavy commission for getting the deal closed, and you're asking them to step getting the deal closed, if you know what I mean, for example.
Brilliant. And that's a great transition for another question that I was keen to ask you is, you were sort of, the business development was trained at the senior managers and senior consultants. Would they also carry a target as well, or a deals won or revenue targets?
Yeah, we, I think it's fair to say we went from kind of fairly informal targeting to slightly more formal targeting. And I see that in most of the businesses I've been involved in. Yeah, I've been in the consulting game for coming up to 30 years. And I think that people have to know what's expected, right? I think that, and there's got to be some level of expectation if you're in primarily a sales role of how much business you are originating. I think it's pretty rare that one person wins a deal, right? Particularly a larger thing. So you then need to work out, well, how are we going to kind of divide up a win? And you can really overcomplicate that if you're inclined to do so. But I think the team's got to have a kind of, that's what we're going for. And some people are going to win and some people aren't. And therefore we've got to have a kind of really strong sense that there's a team target of what we're trying to do as the business. But then I think individuals also have to feel some accountability personally for their slice of the pie and doing everything they can. And really importantly, if you're in a role where you can see, all right, I'm struggling for whatever reason to hit the target or whatever the expectation is, like do something about it early, right? Sometimes markets dip, sometimes deals don't close, and like the business as a whole can wrap its arm around that problem and try to compensate elsewhere. What he can't do is kind of have somebody say, yeah, I promise that this will come through, this will come through, this will come through, and then it just doesn't land at the end. So I think that it's a team sport with individual accountabilities.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Yeah. Funny. I was on a call with a client yesterday. They were talking about someone who was constantly saying this deal's going to come, this deal's going to, and then the next month, and it just happened so long that in the consulting business they were in, then people would start to just distance themselves from that person because they didn't want to be associated with that process. Oh, that's brilliant. So a bit a tangent to say.
Sure.
This is something I haven't prepped you in any way, shape or form for, but the world is changing at a rapid pace. And, and again, if you read anything on LinkedIn, the consulting industry is dying or accelerating, whichever parts you're sitting on. But if you were, say, transitioning out of a large corporate consultancy or a consultancy, and you were going to start off a consulting business with an aim to grow it to something significant right now, part one of the question is there a particular space that you think would be a good ship to ride? And two, how would you go about business development for that? Is there a mechanism or a way that you would advocate would be the best way?
I'm not sure I would. I think the world of professional services and consulting is so vast that I would be loath to say go ride that wave. And I won't say ride the AI wave because that's kind of what everybody's saying. And I'm not sure. I think there's a wave there. Yeah, but it's probably a multifaceted one. I think so I'll dodge that which horse to back question. But I think I think the thing about BD, particularly in the early stages, is you probably have some degree of expertise that you're backing yourself against. You probably got a bit of a network that you think you can sell into. Otherwise, you're probably crazy for trying to do the thing, right? And I think it's just diligently work that network, but do it in a way that's adding value around kind of having conversations that are about, here's a problem that I've got a real interest in, that I think you might have an interest in, either that in somebody that I could help you with, or that you could help connect me with somebody. I just think that the early, and I'd be doing that really heavily in terms of, face-to-face or Teams conversations. I'd be talking about that kind of stuff on LinkedIn. I don't think you can just build a business on LinkedIn. I think it's an important element of it, but I think it's lots of shoe leather, and it's really, but being really clear on like, what's the problem space in which you're trying to operate? How do you think you can help? Asking people's opinion, not being afraid to ask them to refer you to somebody who they might know, even if they don't need the thing. So I think it's just actively every single day, work the network, be visible, have a point of view, but listen more.
Brilliant. And there's a number of different things in there. So thank you for that, John. And it's like, so one of the things that's interesting is, I don't want to take it out of kind of concepts or blow it up too much, but you said like, you would almost be mad to leave a large consultancy or a corporate if you don't have a network to leverage if you were starting out.
Probably a network are a really good idea, right? Like I just think like, if you're going to do that, if you're going to venture out, right, then you have almost certainly, if you're leaving another consultancy, you've probably thought, actually, I've gotten to be really expert in this particular thing, or I've got to know a group of people who just love me and want me, right? And I'm going to back myself to go do that thing or to solve the problems of those people who love me. Right. I can't really fathom that you just think, well, I don't have either of those things, but I'll just see if I can set myself up. I think that's the madness that I was talking about.
Sometimes, I mean, I got to admit, sometimes I do see it where I am just so sick of that that I will go over there because anything is better than that. And I do see that. And then it works great for 12 months or 18 months until that first client project comes to an end. And
And I think you've got to want to build a business, right? You've got to be sufficiently interested in either the problem you're trying to help people solve or the people that you want to work with to be willing then to put in the hard yards that come from, even if all your business is ever going to be is kind of John Howard 8 going from contract to contract, the things will come to an end and you'll have to win the next one. Right. And so you've got to be cut from a kind of cloth that wants to go and do that. And I think it takes either a network or a great idea to do that.
Brilliant. John, so we operate in slightly different spaces because we'll talk about Garwood growth areas. I tend to be more sort of smaller boutique consultancies, and then you can tell us all about Garwood in a sec. Is there a point where there's a definite shift between sort of founder-led, growing the initial phase of the consultancy, and then pushing to put the structures in ready for maybe an event, whatever that event is?
I think there's different ones. So most of our clients are at some type of inflection point, right? And I'll talk about a few of those. So, just to give listeners context. So Garwood Growth works with, professional services business, primarily consultancies, but also we work in legal and accounting and other professional services businesses, on three things: helping with growth, helping with operational improvement, and helping with what we call value realization, which is often somebody's working towards some kind of capital event, be that an exit or a sale to trade or a kind of taking of private equity, whatever that might be. And I think we see and we work with businesses, of multi-country big four implementations of technology at one extreme to very small kind of, late startup businesses. Most of our customers are probably in the kind of 50 to 500 staff range, that kind of size. So what do you see? You see some businesses where the founders or the shareholders, some of which might not have been founders, are thinking, we've kind of taken this to the point where we can, or where we want to. We want to either exit or restructure or stay in the business, but not have to be in a hot seat all the time. How do we get ourselves ready for that kind of transition? Right. And often a lot of that's about shareholder alignment, and are they, as the owners of the business, clear on what they want to achieve with the asset and what the business needs to look like to achieve that? And if they are, great. And often they're not, help them get that alignment. Sometimes, you're working with businesses where sales are absolutely, booming, and it's just hit a delivery breaking point, right? Hit that point where you can no longer, and it's often where you start to get kind of 20, 30, 40 individual projects on the trot, and maybe they're all a bit too small, and then it's taking you can't see and touch it all anymore. And therefore staff are getting burned out. Client impact is suffering a bit just because it's operationally not working the way. Thing that has served you well is no longer serving you well, right? Or it might be somebody who's the opposite thing, like they've just hit a really tough period in the market, and growth in terms of acquisition of new work and clients is a bit stalled. So we work with people there, probably more in your kind of space on, well, what's the growth strategy? Is that a slight diversification? Is it a different approach to go into market? Is there better clarity of what the value proposition is? So there's lots of different, or it might, as a final example, it might be somebody who's starting to branch out international, and they've never had to think about how they organize themselves from an operating model standpoint to think about multi-jurisdiction kinds of working. So it's different scenarios, but it's always a kind of inflection point where the thing that has been really successful up to now is starting to creak a bit, and they just need help, or they're working towards an exit.
So I hope you don't mind me asking this question. It's one I've never really heard many people talking about. It just sprung to mind then while you were talking. I didn't plan this, I promise.
That's right.
And it's something that I've had a couple of conversations with people recently, and within the industry, and what they said is that they find working with consultants, especially sort of founder-led boutiques, quite challenging because they're quite ego driven, if you like, and almost, well, I'm the consultant, I know everything. And they don't eat their own dog food and are not always willing to take on outside advice. Have you ever encountered something like that?
Never. Yeah. I mean, look, I've been fortunate so I've been in a couple of businesses that were heavily founder led and going through a transition. So years ago, a company called Hedra, that was a public sector consultancy that I joined when it was about 85 people, and the owners were bringing in a new team to kind of lead them towards an exit. That lasted about 5 years before we eventually sold to another business. And, I think the founders there, as were the founders in Channel 3, and I've been fortunate in both of those, were really clear on what they wanted to do. They realized they'd got the business where they could and where they wanted to, and they were prepared to make a transition. So were there some issues of people being prepared to let go and sometimes a bit like been out of shape when you reminded them they needed to let go of the thing they said they wanted to do? That, yes, of course. But for the most part, they were really clear on what they were trying to do. And so I personally, in my jobs when I've been working in that kind of business, haven't bumped up against that much. I think that most of the people that we're working with, are there some egos? Yeah, but they've usually engaged us as Garwood because they've got something they want to achieve, and they're open to, and they actually want an external perspective, and they want some external challenge. And I think that that's then about how do you give it to them, right? And about adjusting to what's going to, like, understanding that they've got a lot of their whole kind of world personally and professionally built up in this business. And so of course they've got an ego around it. Been successful. It's probably been most of what they've done during most of their working hours for a long time. So, like, don't just kind of slap them around and say, here's all the stuff you need to do, and forget, not pay due respect to the things that they've done. I've not come across lots of egos. And I'd say probably if you are butting up against that, maybe it's just let them come back when they're ready and the egos are prepared.
I must say it's not my clients. It's not the people I'm currently working with or have worked with in the past. So, okay, so that's fantastic. So, John, again, bit of an offshoot, but looking through your LinkedIn profile, it really what stood out for me is all the brilliant stuff. And I was thinking all those things. But one of your first ever jobs was as what we now call an SDR. And it looks like it was when the SDR role was becoming an emergent force, if you like, in sales, which is pretty much the prospecting role. It's, the mechanization of sales where you were kind of segmenting out the role. So do you think that's helped you having that early sales role in your career?
Yeah, I'm not sure I would classify what I was doing as an SDR. So I kind of like got into doing inside sales of industrial supplies into cement, like manufacturing companies in Latin America. My degree was in Spanish, and I kind of had a lot of contacts in Mexico and stuff. And I was living in Houston at the time, which is, so that's the context for that. I had a really good boss, a guy named Steve, who kind of helped me overcome what was essentially being petrified of having those kind of conversations. Like, my job was to be on the phone to people like, big manufacturing plants in the north of Mexico, making sure we could service. We were basically kind of their importation arm, to say. So we would source stuff and buy it and resell it and ship it. That was kind of the business. And that didn't come naturally to me at all, right? Like picking up the phone to a stranger and having a kind of sales conversation. It wasn't cold calling, right? These were businesses with which Atlas had a relationship, but it was found it really hard. But Steve just forced me to do it, right? And there was no, and I was at a point, I was young, you've got to pay the bills, so you kind of do what you're doing, right? And it was, but what I found was like you pretty quickly build actually really, really good relationships. And this is like, this is early 90s. So there were no Teams calls. It was all on the phone, and it was phone and fax, but you just got to the point where like, you just enjoyed talking to them, and not everybody, right? But ultimately the people that you had the best business with were people who liked you and you liked them. And when you were talking. Yeah, you had the kind of ball bearing to deal with, but actually it was just a kind of catching up. But I think that Steve and his support for me, but kind of probably tough love sometimes, really helped overcome what for me was because I'm a bit of an introvert, with quite a terror almost of just talking to people that I didn't know and that kind of thing. So I think it probably helped break some of that just shyness and barriers down, which probably served me well.
Oh, that's it. And that goes back to what we talked about early on is, even just speaking to your network terrifies people,
If some people find it really hard, like I've found it really hard. Sometimes you still do. Is like, what's my angle with these people? I mean, like I've been knocked back enough times now that it just doesn't bother me anymore. But like, it's not something you come out of the womb knowing how to do necessarily. Some people eat that up. They're just extroverts and they're natural. Like it just comes naturally. Not for lots of people.
Oh, brilliant. John, so coming to the end of the interview, it's been fascinating to hear your stories. And what really stands out for me is the stories that you tell as well, about, all your past things. With all of that history, undoubtedly you've made mistakes. We all make mistakes. But what do you think you've learned from some of the mistakes that you've made that might help people listening to the podcast?
And I think you can, if you're leading a business, you can become too reliant on key people. Yeah, and I think that you never know what's going to happen, or somebody's network, or somebody might leave, or something can happen. So I think that like I'm not sure I could point to a huge mistake in that, but I think that kind of really being conscious of how much key person dependency do you have and not letting yourself get in that situation. Having too many eggs in any one basket, I think particularly, again, from a kind of a leader of an organization, making sure that the people who are in the team who are actively out in the market, there's enough diversification of what you're going after, types of people you're going after, different kinds of work, so that you're not solely dependent on the vagaries of any particular market, which I think is really dangerous. I think there's a lot to be said in consulting for being very niche in what you offer, but it's also, you've got to manage the exposure that creates for you. I think I've not always had, perfect relationships with people I've worked with or managed. And I think that like really, really working on building people up and supporting people and finding what they're really, really good at. And then being frank about, not being afraid to have honest conversations about things that aren't working, but not letting it build up. Like the worst thing you can do is not just actively kind of have a really honest dialogue about what's really good and what could be worked on. And then either party kind of thinks everything's going swimmingly and then finds out that in one person's view, it's not too far down the line. So, I've probably done that to people. It's probably been happened to me. So, that looking after those relationships and really meaning it in the way you do is important.
The brilliance, the essence of human conversation and communication.
Yeah, it's hard. It doesn't come naturally. So
no, it absolutely doesn't. I vouch for all of those things that you've just said. So, John, you've moved now into a new business, if you like, or a new stage of your development. You've mentioned Consultants Growth, working with professional services organizations, consultancies, law firm, professional services is around the bucket. If someone's listening to this and they feel, John's an interesting character, I should speak to him. Is there some sort of bucket that you think, well, these are specifically the type of people that we can help?
I think if you're an ambitious consultancy, professional services business more generally, and you're thinking about, I built a great business, but at some point I'm going to want to not be running this thing or kind of step back a bit. How do I do that? How does this whole world of transactions and exits even work? We could probably give you a hand with that. If it's all feeling just really, really hard or stuck, we could help you with that. If you're thinking about, there's a business over here that I think I might want to acquire or merge with, what does that world of M&A more broadly, not as a kind of, I want an exit, but actually I want a kind of M&A strategy for my business as part of growth. We do a lot of work in that space. If you've got your business held together by kind of spreadsheets and sticky tape and Post-it notes, and it just ain't working anymore from a system standpoint, we do a lot of work in the professional services automation space.
Yeah.
So helping people kind of deal, that systems inflection point can be quite painful. So we do a lot of work in that space. So those are a few.
Brilliant. And where would they find you, John? Just so the audio version of the podcast, if people are listening there, so they know where to find you.
So email, which is john.howard@garwoodgrowth.com, or on LinkedIn. I haven't LinkedIn myself lately, but probably if you put in John Howard Garwood Growth, you would find me. And if not, go back to you and you can find them. You can find me for it.
I will. And obviously in the proper page of this, I'll put all the links and everything.
Yeah, sure.
John, you have been such a fascinating guest. Thank you so much for your time and answering and giving the realities of all the situations you've been in. It's really been brilliant. Thank you very much.
No, appreciate it. Pleasure. And best of luck to you, and look forward to speaking soon.
Thank you.
All right.